Hi, Vonn. Good to see you today.
Hi Shay, how have you been?
Been going good, thank you. Had a busy week last week, actually, after
Mm-hmm.
our conversation, which I really loved with having Sovereign on. Um,
Great.
yeah, that was really good.
This conversation we're going to have today, I think, is going to be enlightening. Well, I do hope it is enlightening. So, as always, synchronicity. I had a discussion with my nephew, not a few days ago or last week, whatever. I've got no idea of time anymore. um, about things that have come up for him to do with his parentage and how things are coming up that made him look at both ancestry. And he was asking some questions about things that he didn't know that I could fill in, of course, on his father's side, and then he was looking at his mother's, and then we talked about this ancestral, um, not so much the trauma, but the fact that the way that I see it, okay, is that we come in with our own individual um, script, I guess, for the purpose of expansion as souls. So we have our own challenges to meet, yeah, that are not there to punish us, but to expand us. At the same time, we come through a lineage. We come through two lineages by both parents, and the parents have had their own challenges. So whatever the parents did not complete, so any challenges or soul intentions that they didn't complete, is then passed forward in the lineage to their children. And I've seen that so clearly over the years I've worked with people. And I've seen it in my own life. And so once I became aware of that, what I did was I kept looking at my children as a sign of the things that I still needed to do some work on. So if I saw my children repeating things that were perhaps a challenge for me that I had not overcome, that I had not been able to alchemize and integrate, then rather than pointing the finger and saying, stop doing that, I would go and do my inner work and look at how I could then transform that. And I would be able to see when I had transformed it, when my children were no longer showing that up. So, when they were not um, in that same space anymore, then all of a sudden they would let it go. And it's such an incredible thing. So when I read your post, and I found it so heartwarming of your experience with these young men last week, I thought, oh Shay, let's dive in and let's look at this ancestral trauma and how it's actually showing up in people and how we can then start to clear it. So I'd really like to hear all about your experience during that wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and I highly recommend people to stay through to the end because there's going to be some really great suggestions, I'm sure, from Yvonne on ways that we can not just discuss our ancestral trauma, but how we can really clear it and heal it and work through it for, having more capacity for the next generation of children and humans coming through to be able to have more resilience and more awareness and have the potential to have a new perspective on the way that we live our lives. And so last week, just to give a bit of background and context, I was at a local school giving multiple presentations to groups of around 50 young men aged around 16 and 17 years, getting ready to leave high school and go and embark on the next chapter or phase of their life, whether they further their education or get a career or, go and travel, whatever they choose. Ultimately, they're all in this period of transition and change. And the presentation is based on the film Liberated, which I feature in, which is available on Netflix. And really, part of the message that I am intending to convey to these young men in, looking at this film from a critical perspective, and then really highlighting some significant key foundational transitional periods in young men's life, which is going from a boy to a man, and just highlighting the distinguishing differences in not just the physical changes and from a boy and a man, but also the psychological shifts that occur from the mentality of a young boy versus the mentality of a man. And this, I feel, is a really key part in human evolution throughout time and through many cultures, to really have a clear marking point and transitional period, or a rites of passage, let's say, where these boys will go through a journey to become a man. And so ultimately what I was doing in the presentation was just opening up discussion like we're doing today around the passing down of this, ancestral trauma that we're exploring and understanding. And ultimately, to give further context to the presentation that I shared with the young men, what I've learned is that if I try and present something to these guys on a screen and teach them, it doesn't have the same effect as if I was to be real with them and share my personal stories of my experience, because what I've noticed is that, one, they listen more, and two, they can relate to it more. And as I began to share some of my own stories and my experience growing up in my journey, which I've shared much of in these conversations with Yvonne, that you guys who are listening in now could always go back and have a look through those great conversations that we've had. But ultimately, recognizing the role that the father, also the mother, but in this case for young men, the role that the father has to play in the raising of healthy and happy young men, particularly helping them transition from boyhood to manhood. And so the post Yvonne was mentioning was when I asked all the students, how many of you feel you have a close relationship with your fathers, that you can share your emotions and share what's going on for you in the world. And there was only one student who put their hand up in a class of 50. Now, I gave this presentation twice and pretty much the same result. And only one, and I was, a little bit taken back by it all. And I asked them then, so why do you think that is? And one student who didn't raise his hand, he basically said that he feels men have a hard time to share their emotions for a start, because they're afraid that they're going to be judged. And I thought that was a really great answer. He pretty much hit the nail on the head. And so I began to share the presentation a little bit further. And then later on, I asked them all, how many of you would love to actually have a relationship with your father? And that's when the whole room exploded and they all put their hands up in the sky, including the teachers at the back. And so it really, when I look back through my life, when I was a young boy, there was a moment that really ultimately triggered my nervous system to contract and be in a state of, fight or flight, and holding on to, which I speak to in the presentation with the young men. It was when I was 13 years old. And at that point, as a young boy, I don't really quite have the psychological maturity or the intellectual understanding of, how human beings function or work. So it's quite evident I'm very immature. I don't even have the intelligence of my own emotions, really. And I remember the moment when I witnessed my own father with another woman, and I was kind of really upset. I took it so personally. I was very upset. I was crying my eyes out. I was just bawling. I didn't want it to believe it to be true. And I remember when I asked him about it, I had finally built the confidence to approach him and ask him the question, like, is this really happening? I'm a young boy. I asked my dad, and he told me to keep it to myself and don't tell anyone. And I remember it was very much unconsciously, but it was also conscious, because I was like, my dad is my hero. I love him and I look up to him, and I care so much about him that I will do what he tells me to do, even at my own detriment. And so I remember at that point, I literally had swallowed all of my emotions, all of the sad and the anger and the upset. Not only had I swallowed all of my emotions, but I literally like gripped onto them so tight and held them in my body, because I didn't want to let them out and express them and tell others, because I was afraid that my dad's not going to love me anymore. He might kick me out of the house. He might not, he's the one, he's my primary support in this period of my life. There's no way I'm going to go against what he tells me to do. And so I didn't realize it till many years later in my life, when I was willing and open to doing more of the inner work, and suddenly out of nowhere, when I was in a deep meditation process, that I had this flood of emotions come through me, and suddenly I was angry and sad, and it was all this stuff, and really I didn't even understand it at the time. It took me years later to process what I was experiencing, but the way that I relate to it now is that I had bottled up and held on to all of these emotions so much inside of myself. It wasn't until later, when I was in more stillness and more awareness of what's going on in my body, that, like a boiling pot, it was boiling, got to the point where the lid blew off and all the emotions came running through me again. And then I began to acknowledge that, wow, that was like I was in a traumatized state, where I was in contraction. My nervous system was in, definitely not expansion. It was in contract and safety and fear and holding together. And so when I had finally released the emotion, then I felt a little bit, unsure and uncertain as to why it was. And I started to put the pieces together when I was reading this wonderful book by a guy called Peter A. Levine, which is talking all about trauma. Because I always thought, like, I'm not traumatized. Like, I've had a very privileged life. I've had, wonderful upbringing, amazing parents in a beautiful country, such fortunate life, which I'm really grateful for and really privileged. But at the same time, as I was reading this book, I began to realize, wow, actually, I have experienced quite a significant and numerous accounts of trauma through my life, and that's okay, because the book is very helpful and hopeful that all trauma can be healed. And I began to look at things from another perspective, and taking myself outside of my shoes and putting myself in my father's shoes, and realizing that, wow, my dad, he had no father growing up, and he was doing the best that he could, raising me and our and my sisters and the family, based upon literally no foundation of a father supporting him. And so, although he done, at times there was moments where I felt like I could have had some more emotional support, or I could have had more connected upbringing. He did a phenomenal job with raising us, but I began to open up, and I remember the moment. This is quite relevant, because I didn't share this with the students, but sharing with you now, it wasn't until later on in my life where I became aware that that moment when I was 13 and witnessed my dad had impacted me so much that 15 years later it was still relevant, because it was there in my psyche. So I decided to have the conversation with my dad, and to see him as a man and have this man-to-man conversation. rather than a condemning and saying, oh, you did this to me and it's your fault, and this really hurt me. I just wanted to open up and share with him how I felt at that time, not necessarily how I feel now, because I had processed a lot of the experience, but also just to invite him and say, hey, look, I really want to have this conversation with you, because I just want to invite you into the conversation to because to explore how we can grow together. And that was a moment, because what I realized was that when I was in a traumatized state, I didn't have the capacity to have much empathy to even consider how others are feeling, because I was in my own fight or flight state and contraction. I was so concerned about my own safety and my own well-being and my own security that often I couldn't empathize with others, because I'm too concerned about my own survival. And so that's one of the very fundamental limits that I experienced being in a traumatized state, and the relevance of clearing it, because what's on the other side of the veil is so much liberation and freedom. But when I began the conversation with my dad, I didn't realize that he was very much still in a traumatized state. So it was huge. And what happened was, a huge emotional release in the conversation. And I had found myself having to be the adult in the situation and create the space to just hold him in that vulnerable, raw, emotional, releasing state, and express that, I still loved him and I still cared for him, but this is what I felt at that time. And that ultimately became a catalyst, huge catalyst, for his initiation into a healing journey, and his own kind of curiosity into exploring his relationship or lack of relationship with his own father, and see that now having a nephew, and my dad's now a beautiful grandfather, what role do we want to play for the next generation? And this is where the ancestral trauma clearing comes into it, because we then both agreed that we wanted to choose to be the best men that we could be in our own lives, to be responsible for, and to pass on, to do the healing work now, so that we can draw the line in the sand and, break the chains of this ancestral trauma that had been, continued on and passing through, to be able to, create the opportunity for the next generation to have and feel that loving support from the men in his life, which is my little nephew, and to show up for that. So it's been it's been a really big, powerful, beautiful journey, and there's lots more nuances to it. But I guess I just wanted to mostly share that, just to kind of highlight from my experience, um, the relevance and the power in choosing to clear my own trauma, and then to look at how I can heal myself, so that it can invite others into their own healing journey, and how powerful that's really been for my family. So really appreciate you opening up this conversation, Yvonne. And after the conversations with the young men last week, realizing that only 1 in 50 in that room were close to their fathers, it really just added fuel to my fire, to really get out there and be activated more, and work on my own relationship with my father, of course, but then also to support young men to make that choices for themselves. So yeah, I've been really inspired recently, and really grateful for this conversation, Yvonne. But I would love to hear also from your experiences and your life, and what you feel is the relevance of doing this healing, clearing work now.
Wow. Thank you so much for that sharing, Shay. That is just so inspiring. It is inspiring because what I love and why I love working with you and with Sovereign is because you are the divine masculine of the future. And we have lost that divinity and the masculinity for over the years, and it's just so heartwarming to see that you are so willing to explore and to go into the depth of emotions to find truth and to find yourselves, because that is really what the journey is all about. So thank you so much. It was just beautiful to listen to. And I hope that our viewers will, share this and play it time and time again. Look, being a little bit older than you, I've been fortunate enough to see several generations. So when I was speaking to my nephew, and I'm going to send this to him, um, we're talking about my experience or his father's experience. And when I looked at my father was emotionally unavailable. And when I looked at my grandparents, then he came from a couple that were forced into marriage through, rules and regulations, and they were as cold as ice. So he was never really loved. He was never loved until he met my mother. And he put her on a pedestal, and she was the only person he could actually give love to. And so he was so disconnected from humanity in a way, because he called everybody was an idiot. It was one of his favorite words. It's not a word that's ever been allowed in my home. So when I looked at that, my nephew was asking about why his father, my brother, was completely emotionally unavailable. And this is where this ancestral trauma carries forward. And what you were finding with these young men, that is exactly what they were experiencing. And what we tend to do, we so quickly go to blame. Oh, well, my father couldn't do this, so da, da, da. But look at what was their lineage, where, we're all end products of other people's input. And our parents could only do what they could do and what they were given from their parents and their parents behind them. So what's really so incredibly important about this time of transition is that it is time to stop the cycle. It is up to us to become consciously aware enough, and that starts with recognition. And I'm sure that many of our listeners would never even have thought about this process of passing on from one lineage to the next, the unfinished, growth, the unfinished awareness, the unfinished path of consciousness. And so what I've also noticed is that whatever the parent hasn't completed, the child then seems to intensify. So what you were talking about with these young boys is that they now feel this more intensely, where probably their fathers wouldn't have had any awareness of that there was something the matter. Because if they'd had the awareness, they would have made different choices. And now you are bringing this to their awareness, and they go, my goodness, look what, there's something big missing in our lives here. And the missing link, of course, is open communications and being willing to allow emotions to be seen and to be expressed. And the funny thing about that is that when the emotions we don't express, like what you've said, and this might be something that might be an aha moment for you, because it's just being fed to me by your soul, is that because you bottled it all up so much, what happens then is our natural way of communicating with each other is in transparency. That is where we're heading back to on this time of ascension and transition. And because that isn't happening to you, your innate was crying out to be noticed. And you said to many times that when you weren't appreciated, when you weren't winning, when you weren't, that was your way of asking for love, asking for, to be noticed. And what just came through was that your injuries were as a result of this swallowing your emotions. When we stuff our emotions, they eventually have to come out somehow, and they come out in dis-ease. One of the most important things for us to recognize and now to participate in is to have not so much a clear physical being, but to have a clear emotional body. We need to go within and we need to look at, where do we feel unheard? Where do we feel unloved? Where do we feel unrecognized? Where do we feel unappreciated? And then we need to turn around and we need to give that to ourselves to start with. Because when we do that, that's a whole other story, but that is where the healing begins. And I don't want to be distracted off the path. So I'm going to go back again to this ancestral journey that we all have to traverse in some manner. So what I found that for me, because we're sharing our stories. So I had this very stern Dutch, emotionally unavailable father who hated people. And being a freedom fighter, in the resistance during the Second World War, didn't improve his, idea of humanity. And on the other hand, I had this incredibly open-hearted, magnificently loving, caring mother. So I had both extremes as parents. And what occurred was that I, thank heavens, followed my mother as far as the opening up my heart and loving people. And even though she lost 99% of her family through, the Holocaust, she never stopped loving people. And she never stopped having an open heart. On the other hand, my father was the opposite. He was as closed as you could possibly get. And as a result, my brother became like my father, and thank heavens he's no longer in the physical realm, because he would absolutely not like me saying that. And I have followed my mother as in the emotional way. Okay, there are many wonderful gifts my father gave me. But emotionally, I followed her and continued that path. But now my nephew, is on that masculine side, has realized that he has completely shut off. And that is now causing him, and he's in his 40s, not to be able to have healthy relationships, either with friends or with significant others, because he has never learned to be emotionally available. And this is what we're now looking at, and this is what you and I want to reveal to people to look at. I'd like everyone to have a look at your parentage, and then your grandparents, and see how far back you can go and find out, what was their history? How did they communicate? How did they relate with each other? How much hugging was there in the family? How much loving was there in the family? And most of all, how much listening was there in the family? We want to be heard. And it's not so many generations ago where it was children ought to be seen and not heard, right? So all these children that grew up, zipped lips, emotionally unavailable, incapable of having any sense of awareness of how to reveal how they felt. We went up here and only ever talked about what we thought. We became intellectual monsters without a heart. Well, that's a bit harsh. Well, that's what I'm being told. But that's what we really became. We became so disconnected from the one part of us that is the most true part of us. That is our magnificent human kindness. And that's what we're coming back to. So these young boys, how fortunate were they to have you reveal yourself and to show that ultimately, when you just shared with us that you gave your father an opportunity to open himself up, because I am sure that from the day that you imploded, he carried guilt until the day that you spoke to him. Because we are energetic sensitives, he would have known, he would have felt you, but he couldn't bring himself to bring it up. You couldn't bring yourself to bring it up. So for all these years, it stewed inside of both of you. And I believe a lot of your injuries were a result of looking to be seen, looking to be taken care of. We cause ourselves to injure or to be ill because what does it draw from others? It draws attention from others. It draws caring and loving from others. Why do we have to get sick or break a leg to get that? Why can't we just have that out freely?
100%. I totally agree. Absolutely. And if you had told me this, 10 years ago, I would have thought you were mad.
Oh, I am that too.
But having experienced it at first hand, I've really began to, feel and observe the metaphysical, energetic side of life on a more subtler plane. And I mean, even when I reflect on the injuries that happened, the dis-ease in my body, which were knee injuries and knee reconstructions and surgeries.
Can I interject for a minute?
Yeah,
Because you know what knees are about?
yeah. That's. Please tell me. Please share.
Knees are the heart chakra. Do you know we have major chakras? We
Mm-hmm.
have at least 22, well, many more minor chakras. And the
Mm-hmm.
knees are the heart chakras. Does that give you a bit of an idea?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And even what I've realized when we're walking, the knees are generally the first body part to lead the body.
Mm-hmm.
And my direction in my life, where I was headed, going down that path, was not a sustainable path to be on long term. And so it was really like kind of symbolic shift that I went through to completely change my trajectory of my life and the direction of my life. Um, at the time, I didn't see the benefit. I was really pissed off and upset and in pain and suffering. But in hindsight, looking back on it, I can really see the importance of that journey to bring me back into more observation and awareness and appreciation for how that has really, impacted my life moving forward, with some key lessons to take away. It only took me 3 operations to realize.
Oh, well, some take longer than others. That's okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's look at this together as far as the clearing of it, because we're talking about this ancestral
Yeah.
trauma. But the wonderful thing is that when we actually alchemize and integrate, So a lot of healing, people tend to think that they have to regurgitate the pain and pull it apart. We're past all that. We don't have time for that. It is all about bringing it home and alchemizing and integrating it with love. And so, going back and taking back any pointing fingers, any blaming or shaming that you might have done, um, where you feel you weren't loved enough, and love them in return. I have such great compassion for my father when I look at his history and how unloved he was as a child, and then to his soul took him to the total opposite, where he married somebody who was so loving, and then to watch her suffer because she internalized all her pain of losing all of her family. It was a large family, and she was never able to express that pain because he was unavailable. He just walked away and went after the war and went, that's it, it was never spoken about again. And so the she internalized that, and she spent the rest of her life being ill. Just one trauma in her physical body after another because she had nowhere to take it. And so it's so important that we express our emotions, that we have this communication. And that is something that you discovered when you finally broached the subject with your dad. And that takes courage. It takes enormous courage. And I applaud you for that, because that healed both of you. And a lot of people will say, yes, but my parents or grandparents are now no longer here. They're still here. Just call them in spirit and have a chat with them. I love talking to the dear departed because, they can't argue with you as much as they used to. And really reveal. And for me, what I find really important is to write things. Take it out of your head, write it down, and then love it into peace, acknowledging that you've chosen this path for a reason, and that if you have chosen these parents, which I believe we do, then you have it within you to not just survive it, but to thrive from it. And the only way you can do that is to heal them. And once you heal them, which is what you did for your dad, that breaks the cycle just like that.
Yes, it's so true. Breaks it in an instant. And I mentioned it at the beginning, and I kind of want to share a little snippet from the book that really helped serve me on the realization of how to heal trauma and recognizing that all trauma is healable. Was when I was reading through it, kind of breaks down what trauma is, like, and he really relates really well to reflecting on the animal kingdom too, and what animals naturally do in a state of contraction and trauma when they go into this immobilization, so they kind of freeze, like in an antler that's playing dead, and it kind of stops. And then even when you look at dogs, for example, to come out of a traumatized state, which is like when they're frozen, they're numb and they're not feeling anything, and they're kind of stuck in a fight or freeze or flight mode. And then what they do to come back into their body, into their felt sense, to come back into their alignment, is they shake. And the dogs have a really trembly, shaky shake that helps them to release the physical trauma, but also, like you said, with the emotional body, to release the emotions and express them through the body to be able to move and clear it. And I remember, again, like when I was younger, I always thought there's no way that I am traumatized. There's not a chance, And reading this book, I began to realize that biologically as well, undergoing the surgeries, physically going through the operations, that my body, even though I was out cold under the anesthesia, the anesthetics, and kind of don't remember a thing about the operation, biologically, on a physical level, my body had been imprinted with a very traumatic kind of severe operation that was cutting and drilling and prodding at my body in the cells, and that my knees were, and I remember, numb. I had no sensation, no feeling in my knees for a long, long time because it was just completely numb. It had numbed out all the nervous system had been completely disrupted, the nerve endings in that region. And in the book, what they suggest, and I suddenly realized, well, I'd been undergone a traumatic experience from the process of surgery. But then how do I heal this, and how do I work through this, as well as the emotional release and the energetic work that was relevant? The simple exercises that they recommend in the book was to come into the felt sense, so the feeling sense, which is where the emotional aspect comes in. But a simple practice that he suggested to go and do was to, whenever you have a shower, for example, stand under the head of the shower and just really feel where the water is hitting, your body, your head, and then slowly do it through all areas of your body and really tune into feeling the patter of water. And I had to do it through my legs and on my knees and all over my body to practice it, to really practice tuning in my subtle awareness on the areas that I would normally avoid and ignore and suppress. And that's where the emotions that I didn't want to, deal with, or that I was holding on to, began to kind of arise, because now I'm starting to look at areas of my body and feel into these spaces that had been numbed and that had been traumatized and that I didn't want to look at because I was protecting myself, but not realizing that in the protection mode, I was actually suppressing myself. And so it wasn't going to necessarily serve me longer term. And that process was really beneficial because it was very kind of tangible and easy to relate to and to put into place in practice. But I feel in the clearing of it as well, the dynamic of empathy, as you had really spoken to really beautifully and elegantly, of having compassion for other humans and seeing that, seeing, instead of being resentful and bitter at my father, recognizing that, wow, he never, had his own father. And to see it from his perspective, that we are both just a child to someone, and then we have the choice to either stay, in this immature boy-like state, childlike state, or, transcend that and choose to be embodied as a man and do the healing work, and then offer, our vulnerable stories for others to reflect on their own journey, and to, just inquire within themselves how they have felt through their lives or not felt. Because that's what I realized in that period, after being in a traumatized, contracted state, I was doing whatever I could to cope with and numb any of the feelings. I would drink and smoke and do drugs because I didn't want to feel, when the process of healing was guiding me back to feeling the feelings, even if they're not necessarily always the yummy, juicy, beautiful, loving feelings, which would be nice. But, going to the depth as well and feeling all of the raw emotions of anger and sadness and grief and shame, and then really expressing it and releasing it and, transcending it ultimately.
Emotions are the language between the inner and the outer. So, I used to ask the question of my soul, well, what's the point of incarnating into this physicality, because you haven't got our five senses. And then, I was really pointed to, to these wonderful vortices that we call chakras, which are the gateways between the inner and the outer. So our emotions create the vibrational frequency that then is felt, or expands or contracts the soul. It's a beautiful system, and when we block it, we cannot possibly do well. We have to learn that this is an amazing organism of creation that we've got to give freedom to. And our emotions are so special. And the problem is that many people either completely block them or they collapse into them, right? And both are equally damaging. When we feel our emotions, and we just collapse. An emotion is there to give you a message, to again bring you closer to know thyself. And it is such a beautiful journey. There's a little sort of extra that I want to throw in here, and that is that we've never really looked at the role of the opposite sexed parent. So you've been talking all about, boys becoming men from the leadership of the father figure. But I believe that women make men. And that it is really important to recognize that there is an opposite sexed parentage that needs to be healthy. And it isn't in many, many situations due to our programming. So a boy learns how to be a man by how his mother treats him. I'm always saying, give the boy his stick. Make him feel that he is the man. Give him this feeling of that he is strong, that he is important. But most importantly, listen to him. Encourage him to speak. Encourage him to show love. And not this ridiculous social trauma that we have that it's a weakness for a man to cry. I love men who cry because I think that it shows that they're in tune with themselves. They're human. Think about the pain of all these swallowed tears, because we are emoting beings. So if we don't allow those emotions out, where do they go? Right? Internally, and instantly we are out of balance. And so for me, when we looked at the opposite sex role, so women teach men how to treat women. So when you see men who treat their women badly, don't only look at how their fathers treated women, yes, but look at how they were treated and look at their mothers. Look at how, this is so powerful for me. I've got two sons, and when they were born, I made a real promise in my heart that no woman would ever knock on my door and say, you created a lousy husband and an awful father, and I can promise you that they have not. Because that was my role. My role was to teach them how to be men, how to be fathers, how to be loving and caring and open and nurturing to their families. That comes from the woman. The woman is the nurturer. So when you look at your father and see that he didn't have a father, I would like you to spend some time to look at his mother and see where she came from and what her lineage was. And that's how we start to identify our own trauma And then also learn to heal the trauma of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And the beautiful thing about that is that when we alchemize and reintegrate with love the trauma, we break the cycle and heal the lineage behind us, and we prevent it going forward. So we also heal the lineage ahead of us. Now, you think that might be important?
It's definitely very important. Yeah. And I love that you brought this aspect of looking at the role of the feminine in the raising of younglings. It's just as important, really, and significant role to raising, healthy and whole young beings into the world.
Yeah, and the opposite role of the father is of bringing up children. That's why girls love to be daddy's little girl,
Hmm.
because they're always looking for a protector. As a procreator, we need to have someone protect us while we sit on the nest. This is syntropy, as you know. This is how nature works. So if the father does not instill the femininity into their daughters and show them with gentleness and caressing and caring and treasuring, and make them feel that the masculine is there to honor them and present, and that has become so distorted in latter years. I'm horrified at the relationships between boys and girls. They have got so lost.
Mm.
No, really. I love the days of courting. I think it is so important that women once more ask to be respected and honored, and that we respect and honor our men. We have to come home to that.
Mm.
We have to heal that. Wow, Shay, I don't know, but I feel very emotional about this whole discussion. It's been so heart connected, so honest and open,
Mm.
and I'm so grateful to you for it.
Yeah, thank you to Yvonne for, just creating this consistent opportunity for us to explore deeper into who we are and to why we're here, and to make the choice to be creators of our destiny, of our future, for our families and our friends and our communities. So thank you. Yeah, really.
Well, just let's keep on doing the work.
Definitely. I'm committed to that.
Love you for being who you are, and keep shining your light.
Thank you, Yvonne.
See you soon.
See you next time.